Good evening, everybody. Welcome. How are we? It's like starting class. Hi. Good evening. Thanks. I don't need any applause. Just a little. Are you out there? Are you awake? It's nice to see everyone. It's my pleasure to warmly welcome you to the University of Southern Maine this evening. My name is Libby Bischoff. I am the Executive Director of the Osher Map Library and Smith Center for Cartographic Education and a Professor of History. And it is really our privilege this evening to be co-sponsoring James Francis's talk, Penobscot Sense of Place, Penobscot Language and Landscape this evening. And it's funded via our Matson New York Times Lecture Fund. And we're really happy to be working with our friends at Portland Public Schools again, particularly the Wabanaki Studies Curriculum Initiative. So we thank them for being our partners on this and so many other events. Everything's more fun with friends. So yay, Portland Public Schools. James's talk is part of a larger series of talks we've been sponsoring this year on history and place from indigenous perspectives. Maps for hundreds of years, as you might imagine, have served as tangible symbols of colonization and dispossession of land. And tonight's lecture on Wabanaki origins of geographic place names in Maine is especially relevant to the decolonizing work that's necessary in any 21st century map library and educational institution at that. So we invite you to come back and join us in March. On March 21st, we open our bicentennial exhibition, Mapping Maine, the Land and Its Peoples, which reckons with many of these issues. And so you can see them kind of play out on the maps. And it will be up through October 10th, so you have plenty of time to see it. I want to give a special shout out to Fiona Hopper, because I don't think she gets it. Oh, see, you got a lot of fans, Fiona, who is the social studies lead teacher and Wabanaki studies coordinator at Portland Public Schools, who is so very helpful in co-organizing these events with us. We invite you, if you didn't on the way in, to visit the table of USM's Native American Student Alliance. They're selling stickers and cookies. What more can you ask for? So if you didn't get a chance to chat with them, please do so. They have lots to tell you about that's going on with their group. And before I turn it over to Fiona, who will introduce James, I want to do a land acknowledgement, and it is one that I have invited James to critique after the show. So we'll see. But my acknowledgement, and I recognize that it's mine, it's for Machigon, the truest name in Maliseet poet Miku Paul's words of the now called city of Portland, where the Osher Map Library sits on the campus at our University of Southern Maine. And so we sit together in this auditorium this evening on land that was once water and part of a water-based ecosystem, which for thousands of years before the French and English set foot on the neck, provided for the indigenous peoples of the Dawnland, the Wabanaki, and those who were here from the beginning, in kinship with the land and the water, and in kinship with all of the beings who were then sustained by the land and the water together. And so we acknowledge this truth as we acknowledge the contemporary presence of Abenaki and Penobscot, Passamaquoddy, Mi'kmaq, and Maliseet peoples, and as we acknowledge the devastation of settler colonialism, past and present. And so I acknowledge in my own work that any land acknowledgement is only that. So no matter how sincere, it's only a beginning of the collective work that we need to do hand in hand together with the tribes and with each other as Maine moves forward, particularly in this bicentennial year. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Fiona Hopper, who will introduce James, and then we will turn it over to James, which is why you really came. So thank you.
Welcome, everyone. I'm so glad to see so many familiar faces tonight. It's my great pleasure to introduce James Francis this evening. I first introduced James 4 years ago when he came to speak to a group of Portland teachers taking a class that I was co-teaching at the time. I depended a little too heavily on Google and perhaps my own imagination and got a few things wrong. My introduction included a description of James' military service that made him sound as if he'd been a flight commander/surgeon simultaneously, leading battalions and bandaging wounds all at high altitude. This James Bond-like representation has been a running joke between us ever since. especially because I've since managed to repeat those errors several times, thinking I had edited the previous year's introduction. So tonight, in front of this large crowd, is my opportunity to finally redeem myself. So I'd like to share a brief story to illustrate both James's skill as a teacher and to hopefully set up my fellow white folks and educators to get the most out of this evening's talk. Sometimes my people are a little slow on the uptake, so I'm going to help you all out. About a year and a half ago, during the first few days in my role as the Wabanaki Studies Coordinator for the Portland Public Schools, I drove up to see James. No doubt he had heard the anxiety in my voice when I called him the week before to tell him that this new position was official. I wanted to talk to him about what an accurate, respectful, and well-done Wabanaki Studies program would look like. The truth is, I was completely overwhelmed, and the well-trained, highly colonized, perfectionist white girl in me just wanted him to tell me what to do. In answer to my questions, James told me a story of how he teaches children at Indian Island School about the relationship between the Penobscot people, the river, and the ecosystem. He had told me this story several times, and I knew enough to know that it was important, that it was probably offering some answers to my questions, but I didn't know enough to know how. That afternoon, we went out for lunch at the Boom House, which overlooked the massive dam spanning the Penobscot River in Old Town. James kept looking out at the river, then walked to the window for a better view. I had never seen someone look at a river with such attention and interest. It was as though a celebrity had walked in the room, and I was the only one who didn't know who it was. When I left that afternoon to drive back to Portland, I looked out at the river, trying to see what James saw. I noticed how huge it was, so much wider than I had realized before. The water seemed to move in every direction at once and downstream. When the sun hit the water, it finally dawned on me. The river was what was most important, this one, and all rivers. And then it dawned on me how little I knew about rivers, Penobscot and otherwise, or even what there was to know, or how to go about learning what a river is. I've come to call this lack of knowing place ignorance, and it is not just a byproduct of settler colonialism, it is the work of settler colonialism. And in my experience with anti-racist work and in land-based education, indigenous presence, indigenous concerns, indigenous anything have been overwhelmingly absent. This leaves the vast majority of social justice-minded, ecologically friendly folks, white folks in particular, in a continued state of place ignorance. And it is the work of James Francis and other indigenous scholars, teachers, leaders, and thinkers who continue to shed light on this most fundamental violence of settler colonialism, the elimination of place knowledge. As we enter into a year of bicentennial celebrations, all things Maine will be everywhere. But what is Maine, other than a political representation, a concept, or in the words of Benedict Anderson, an imagined community? We know the shape of Maine, but what is it, really? Or the name of Maine, what does it mean? In the name is a story of recent human history, of warring colonial powers, natural resources to control, profits to be made, but nothing about the place itself, the ecosystem, the relationship between resources and people, between people and place. Tonight, you, like me, will not be handed answers. You'll be offered information to make sense of in your own way. In the world of teaching, we call this best practice, and we aspire to it. In indigenous communities, I've come to understand, this is just how things are done. And if you're a non-indigenous person like me, then you'll have to work for it. You have to listen, you have to pay attention, and you have to open to the idea that you know much less than you think you do. And though James may not be the military superhero Google and I depicted him as so many years ago, he, like a commander pilot surgeon, is a man of diverse talents, energy, and tremendous creativity. He puts together historical, cultural, linguistic, and natural resource knowledge making accessible a worldview that sees this place in relational terms rather than transactional terms. He schools in a literacy that gets scant attention in dominant culture, the literacy of place. Please join me in welcoming historian, language revitalizer, visual artist, filmmaker, writer, cartographer, comedian connoisseur, advocate, guide, leader, storyteller, teacher, and my friend, James Eric Francis Sr.
Good evening. When are you going to come down? When are you going to land? I should have stayed on the farm. I should have listened to my old man. Anybody recognize that? Yeah. It's a song by Elton John, Goodbye Yellow Brick Road. You ever had one of those songs that when you hear it, it kind of transports you back in time to that place or that person or that first kiss? This song does that for me. And for me, it transports me all the way back to when I was probably 3 or 4 years old. And each and every time that song starts, I can visualize the skyline of Boston as we crossed Tobin Bridge. It was nighttime. My mother had packed myself, my older brother, his name is Jojo, and my younger sister Renee, into a little panel truck. She was leaving my father. We had lived in southern New England. I was born in New Britain, Connecticut. And he had committed adultery with the woman who lived upstairs in another apartment. So she packed up her kids and she headed home. And when I hear that song, in particular, the words, "You know you can't hold me forever," I can see her lips singing the song. She had turned up that music, and it was burned into my mind. I've never bought the CD. I've never downloaded that song. I let it come to me as songs come to you. Because it's an important song to me, because as we were heading up Route 1, then 95, we made our way to Indian Island. This song has captured the first time I ever went home. And I'm blessed to have that song, because it is this little island in the Penobscot River has defined who I am. That's my mom. And as we pulled into the driveway that next morning of my grandmother's house, and she's in the car too, you can see her in the corner. That's where we would live for many years until my mom got her own house. So I grew up in a house with a single mother, a brother, a sister, and a grandmother. And I was blessed to have that. Now there's a little irony to this story, because that little panel van that she packed us up into and we headed north in was actually a Mayflower moving van. And so to go to an Indian reservation, there's a fair bit of irony. So I grew up in Old Town on Indian Island. Went to high school under the Old Town Indians moniker. Ran track, was quite successful. After high school, I joined the Air Force, and I was stationed in Cheyenne, Wyoming. Anybody ever been to Cheyenne, Wyoming? Cheyenne's a vastly different place than Maine. The trees that are there were planted by the cavalry back in the day when it was Fort D.A. Russell. It's Francis E. Warren Air Force Base today. And I joined the Air Force because I was intrigued by airplanes, and the Air Force paid me back by sending me to a base that didn't even have a runway. It was a missile base, home of the Peacekeeper, a big MX missile. Minutemen also, but I was very homesick the 4 years that I spent there, and I wasn't homesick for my mother or my grandmother, and certainly not my brother. But I was homesick for the landscape. And I met a girl while I was there, and I got married too young because she's no longer my wife. And she came to Maine and actually felt claustrophobic here. Because in Wyoming, at 6,600 and some odd feet above sea level, which is all higher than any place in the state of Maine, there's very few trees, and you can see up to 50, 60, 70 miles in any direction. Here, you're lucky if you can see out of the yard. So she felt very claustrophobic, and when I decided to divorce the Air Force, she divorced me. So after about 3.5 years, there was a decision that had to be made. The Air Force asked you, are you gonna re-up? You're gonna rejoin the Air Force? And my grandmother was very sick, and I had come home, and on her deathbed, she had told me that I had been given a gift and that I needed to find a way to give it back. And I was really confused by this because the only gift that I could think of at the time was when I was 13 years old, she had bought me a pair of Spider-Man underoos. And which is fine, my grandmother, I was a little too old for Spider-Man underoos. And I had an older brother, Jojo, I mentioned him, and he's 2 years older than me, but I skipped a grade and he stayed back in the 8th grade. So we ended up going to high school together. And my brother is kind of a needler, picks on people all the time, and I was his main target. And so we'd be standing around because we had mutual friends, and he'd look me up and down, he'd be like, "Hey, Spidey." So that was the only gift that I really could think of. But in retrospect, later, I realized that when I was 10 years old, I had knocked on the door of an elder's house and asked her what the sign "Wounded Knee" meant on her. That was affixed to her house. And she invited me in, and I spent some time with this elder over the years, learning language and stories, and she really fostered my desire for wanting to know history. And so that was the gift that she was talking about, not the underoos. So I decided to leave the Air Force, and I got home and I went and matriculated at the University of Maine to study history. And one of the first things I did was to take Native American Studies classes. And we learned about the Trail of Tears, the forcible removal of the Cherokee Nation from their homeland to some alien landscape. And I say alien landscape because it was foreign to them. And I thought about my time in Cheyenne and how different that was and how out of place I felt. And I had a lot of admiration for the Cherokee people because they survived. They survived in that new landscape. How did they know where the best water was? How did they know those red berries were edible? They had generation upon generation of knowledge in their homeland. So as I was walking across the campus of the University of Maine, I looked at this pine tree and something hit me. We, as Penobscot people, have never been removed from our homeland. That pine tree is a descendant of the same pine trees my ancestors dealt with. Here I am, 22 years old, and it was the most profound thing that ever happened. It changed the way I looked at the world, particularly my homeland. I went back down over the hill. I went to see my advisors and changed everything. I took geology classes of Maine, geography. I took everything I possibly could that related to this state so I could understand this place more, so I could understand how my ancestors lived. This is when I was really introduced to somebody who, in my community, was considered a racist, Henry David Thoreau. You get to about page 6 of the Maine Woods, and you hear a description of my community, of Indian Island, which isn't very nice. Oh, the church, that's Rome's doing. In fact, he concludes the thing by the description of my community by saying that he would rather had seen a row of wigwam and someone burning at the stake than what he saw. Needless to say, not a lot of Penobscot people get past page 6 before they kind of cast this aside. I stuck with it a little longer and realized that Henry David Thoreau grew up in Concord, Mass., the son of a pencil maker, and his eyes were always to the ground as he walked the paths between towns, and he was looking for relics. He was looking for stones. He even knew if Farmer Brown was plowing his field in the fall, that's the first place he'd go to in the spring, because the thaw would reveal all these lithics from Native Americans. And the Peabody Museum at Harvard has a vast collection of what he collected. And when he came to Maine, he was disappointed because he saw the church. He saw ramshackled houses. He saw the scars of colonialism in our community. And that's what he disliked, because he expected to find what he called the noble savage. He wanted to find relics of people who were untouched by the civilization, which he often questioned. He comes in here in 1846, 1853, and 1857. In 46, he tries to hire a guide, but it doesn't work out. He tries to hire Louis Neptune, who helped climb Katahdin for the first geological survey. But he gets impatient and he leaves the rendezvous town of Mattawamkeag before Louis Neptune gets there and decides to go up a river with a bunch of logmen who he felt blessed to have with him. 1853, he hires Joseph Atzian, and in 1857, he hires Joe Polis. Joseph Atzian is probably the most, well, he's my favorite. He's my favorite Penobscot historical figure because he embodies so much. He was born on Christmas Day in 1829. And we're a very Christian Catholic community. We've had Christianity in our community. We had black robes back in the 1600s. I grew up in a school with nuns. It wasn't until 1989 that there wasn't a nun running our school on Indian Island. Joseph Atkins was our first elected chief ever, a system that was imposed by the state. Now, Joseph's father, John Atkins, was the chief, and he's actually considered our last hereditary chief. But I make the argument that Joseph Atkins is our last hereditary chief because upon his death, John Atkins' chiefship would have been passed to his son, which was Joseph Atkins. But he was our first elected chief. And Joseph dies. He dies a hero in Maine history. He dies in a place called Grand Pitch on the west branch of the Penobscot, a place not far from Millinocket. When a paddler would paddle north on the west branch, they would get to a place called Shad Pond, and then they would hang a right and go up Millinocket Stream, about a half mile, and then they would take their canoes out of the water and take a portage across to a place called Quakish Lake. And the reason why they did this is because there's kind of a gorge in the river that has a lot of pitches. Pitches aren't falls. They are falls. They're extreme falls. Growing up canoeing, I was always told that you run falls and you portage pitches. That pitches are to be gone around. You don't run them. So Grand Pitch was in this gorge, which was avoided. But in 1870, on the 4th of July, when Joseph Atkins died, they were running logs down the river, and you can't portage logs across a path, so you have to run them down the river. And there was a skeleton crew because many people were in Bangor for the Independence Day celebrations, as it was 4th of July, and an inexperienced boatman in the front of the boat made a mistake. The boat struck a rock sideways, and the river started to tear the bateau apart. The last anyone saw Joseph Atkins alive, he was up to his knees in water, trying to save men who were clinging to the boat. He was the only one to lose his life on that day. They say that they hung his logging boots on a pine knot adjacent to where they pulled his body out at Shad Pond below the gorge. Some say they're still hanging there today. I've never gone to look. In 1857, Thoreau hired Joe Polis. He had hired Atkins from the streets of Bangor. He had met him in Bangor. But for Polis, he went to Indian Island, and Polis was in his front yard of a house that still stands today on the reservation. He was skinning a deer hide next to his beautiful flower garden. They spent 13 days in the wilderness, and Thoreau wrote, "As we drew near Old Town, I asked Polis if he was not glad to get home again. But there's no relenting to his wildness. And he said, 'It makes no difference to me where I am.' Such is the Indian's pretense always. It makes no difference to me where I am." That whole 13 days, Polis was at home. Didn't matter where he was. If he was on Indian Island with his house and his garden, or if he was on the river, sleeping under his canoe. Didn't matter. One of the most intriguing things that I got from reading The Maine Woods, and I've read it several times at this point, was in the index. And in the index, Thoreau started to document birds and flowers and other things that he saw in the Maine woods. And in his journals, volumes and volumes of writings that never really got published. They were later, after he died, were published as these journals. He writes, "The Indians stood nearer to wild nature than we, the wildest and the noblest quadrupeds, even the largest freshwater fishes, some of the wildest and the noblest birds, and even the fairest flowers have actually receded as we advanced, and we have but the most distant knowledge of them. It was a new light when my guides gave me Indian names for things which I only had scientific ones before. In proportion as I understand the language, I saw them from a new point of view. A dictionary of the Indian language reveals another and a wholly new life to us." You know, the elder that had Wounded Knee written on her house told me that to truly understand the culture, you must understand the language. And to truly understand the language, you must understand the culture. So there's this kind of cyclical nature that goes on. And she talked about, aguiden, which is the word that we use for a canoe, a birch bark canoe. And it doesn't just mean canoe. It actually translates into that which floats lightly. Tells you something about the character, the nature of that boat. Especially considering its predecessor was a big, clunky dugout canoe, heavy. And also a birch bark canoe, being light, is something you could just put over your head and walk through the woods on many portages. So all this conveyed in this one name just really shows the beauty of the language. And as I started to study maps and look at old writings, I ran into Fanny Hardy Ekstrom's book from 1943 on Indian place names in the Penobscot River and the coast of Maine. She writes, "The day is past when our Indian names were the butt of foolish laughter, to be distorted, mutilated, displaced by trivial appellations. All Indian place names had a local pertinency. In recovering the meaning and the correct form of the names, we enlarge our horizon and make home a more romantic place to live in. These old names are the colored curtains which hang beside the windows through which we look back into beginnings of humans living here. For ages upon ages, countless human beings have lived and toiled and suffered here." And here in Maine, they're all over the place, these place names. And as we start to kind of examine what these place names are and how we interpret these, that cultural piece keeps coming up. And I was in a language conference out west in Minnesota, which was a blend of Algonquian speakers, which Penobscot language is a part of that larger family, but also from the Dakotas, those people. So this language conference was very mixed. Somebody said, Tatanka Wiyus, and I knew Tatanka was a buffalo, and I knew, because they spoke in both languages, Tatanka Wiyus, and Wiyus is meat, so it was buffalo meat. But there was this kind of talk about there's a predictability to language, that the more you understand culture, you can almost predict language. Now, there's a little game that I like to play here, if you're all up for it. It involves a little bit of math, but I think we can get through it. No one shout out the answers, keep them to yourself. I want you to pick a number between 2 and 9. Multiply that number by 9. You should end up with a 2-digit number. Add those 2 digits together. Once you get that number, subtract 5. All right? Now, for each number that you get, there's a corresponding letter. A is with 1, B is with 2, C 3, D 4, E 5, all the way to Z 26. So take that number and that corresponding letter, and with that letter, think of a country that begins with that letter. With the last letter of that country, think of an animal. And with the last letter of that animal, think of a color. So you should have 3 things: country, an animal, and a color. So I want a show of hands. How many people have orange kangaroos from Denmark? What happened? Did I just read your mind? No. So first of all, there's a math wizard 2 in the room who says, yeah, well, that 9 is... So you all landed on 4, if you did the math right, because 9 is somehow magical, because 3 is magical, and that's 3 times 3. So the math was all a ruse. But the whole thing about, majority of us in the room have been educated in American schools. And the first place, and this is the understanding of the culture piece, the first place we go is, oh, a country? Let's go to Europe. We'll look around. Oh, there's Denmark. Boom, I got it. And then kangaroo, sometimes I get aqua koalas, but kangaroo and orange usually follow. And so this is just understanding the makeup of the language, but also understanding the culture, understanding a majority of us were educated in a certain kind of way. And this isn't mine. This was actually at that conference. But it really illustrated something, and it's really fun because you all laugh. All right, let's get back down to business here. So as I started taking a lot of cultural geography classes over the years, I ran into this, Ifu Tuan. This is a formula. Space, so an area, plus culture equals place. So say a space like the Penobscot River Valley, plus the people that live there or identify with that place, define what place is. It's how we interpret what's going on. So given that this is a formula, I quickly realized that we can play with this, that we can supplant the culture that's there today, the Maine, Western kind of American culture that is there, which is defined by like log driving and pollution, and even in modern times, the cleanup of the river. Penobscot River is one of the most cleaned up rivers, Penobscot River restoration, all of that. That's defining it by a Maine, Eurocentric, Western, ideal kind of culture. What if we took that cultural piece and put Penobscot culture in there, the indigenous people of that place, by understanding culture, the seasonal round, the place names? What does that tell us about what that place is going to be? So this formula allows us to kind of mess with that. What's this? Katahdin, right? And that's how we spell Katahdin in the language. Isn't that right, Connor? So what does Katahdin mean? Does anybody know? Greatest mountain. Does that make sense? Why? Why does greatest mountain make sense? No, there's mountains near it. The answer I often get is, it's the largest in Maine, and which is mixing apples and oranges, because the name Katahdin is a very ancient name. It's been in our culture since time immemorial. Don't even know what Maine is. Don't even know, that shape. And if you take into the landscape into consideration, Mount Washington, which is just across the border, is taller. And besides, if you were walking by Mount Washington one day as an indigenous person, that's a pretty big mountain, and then a few weeks later you were walking by Katahdin, you wouldn't know which one was higher. I mean, it's really hard. Katahdin wasn't even measured until like 1802, so we knew how high it was. So oftentimes people equate Katahdin being greatest mountain as biggest mountain, as the tallest, and that is not accurate at all. What does it mean? What do we mean by greatest mountain? I don't know. I know we have oral traditions that tell us that Gluskabe, our cultural teacher, subject of many oral stories, after he was done teaching us everything we needed to know, he climbed into his canoe and he paddled north, and this is his lodge. And that his family lives in there, making arrowheads for a war that is yet to come. Is that what makes it great? Maybe. I don't know. All I know is when I go there, when I stood there to take this picture, I could feel it. There's an energy, there's a reverence, there is something about this mountain that no other mountain can do to me personally. When we look at Penobscot Place, you're going to find a few different things through the interpretation of them. A lot of them are geologic or geographic description. And these act as the big green DOT signs that we see on the side of the highway, because it's exactly what they are. Penobscots, culturally and historically, were migratory people. And I don't mean like herds of caribou. It wasn't we're going through the woods today and, a berry bush we eat today. No, we knew where those berry bushes were. We knew when they would be ripe, and we knew best way to get there. Very sophisticated migratory pattern. Summers on the coast, because why not? So actually for food, because of the shellfish, and to get away from mosquitoes, which is great. There's plenty of food in the summertime to feed all of us. This whole room, if we're all one big tribe, we could all hang out down by the beach and have plenty of shellfish to eat, and maybe dragging a few deer here and there, and we'd be just fine all summer long. But coming into fall, and especially into winter, the carrying capacity of the land could not support all of us. Just couldn't happen. So me and my family, we're going to travel upriver 100 miles, up to the Mattawamkeag, up into maybe where Island Falls is and the lake that's up there. And that's where we have gone year after year, and we know the hunting areas there, and we know where to gather the nuts and the berries, because we need to get ready for winter. And that's who I'm going to hang out with all winter, is just my kin, these kinship bands. And each one of our kinship bands had a different place we would go, and we would travel there by canoe. And these geologic and geographic description helped us get there. They provided that roadmap. Sometimes place names are natural resource based. Hemlock Island, Birch Stream, Sometimes there was a specific task. This is the place where we tanned hides. Or this is Gut Island. Yeah, right by Indian Island, there's a little island called Gut Island. And what did we do there? We got fish because right below Indian Island was like one of the best fisheries in the Penobscot River. It's why the village is where it's at. But where do you want to gut your fish? All in the same place, and no one's going to live there. We're just going to gut fish there and let the raccoons have it. So that name persists till today. And sometimes we have legends, and I'll talk about a couple, that kind of reinforce these names and they appear on the landscape. So this is Indian Island. Big Bog Island, French Island. And this island with the airport, this piece of land at the bottom, is also an island, and that's really important. Kind of looks like this. So we're looking at, B and the top of C when we're looking at this. So there's a piece of river kind of between here and here. This piece had a name itself. In Penobscot, we didn't just name the whole river and that was it. Each individual part of the river had a different name because it was about the character of that river in that place. And this place is called Qualbuck something, something, something. It's a big long word, and I had asked Carol Dana what it meant, and she's like, oh, that's in that song. We have a song called the Women and Girls song, and it's called Tutuwas, and the men would bang on a piece of wood, and pine needles would dance around on the wood standing up, and then they would call out commands trying to get the women and girls to dance like the pine needles. So they would tell them to spin or to fall down, and there's all these different commands to the song. And she goes, that's that command to turn and spin. So I had these maps that I've been working on for years, and I wrote it down. And my Uncle Neil, who just passed away about a month ago, he built a house up on Big Bog Island. It's an old railroad grade up there, and he built it right on a pier on the river. Beautiful place. And he used to cross this piece of river, go to the airport, and call my mother, who owned a coffee shop on the reservation, and she'd go pick him up, and he'd come over and drink coffee, and that's where I was. And he saw my map, and he tapped on it. He goes, that makes sense. I was like, how? Because I thought, her interpretation was off. He goes, well, that part of the river, if there's a freshet, a flood, it'll flow to the left and go down this side of the island. And if it's during normal flow, it'll flow the other way. So with this information, I went back and did some more research. And before the dam, there was actually a reversing falls there. And that piece of the river is named. It actually took it back to Carol. And she goes, oh, yeah, it means where the river turns back upon itself. And so it's a whole process. And to kind of decode these, and it also takes field work. I would have never realized that river flowed in both directions. Neil, who crossed it regularly, knew that and let me know. Big Bog Island, Kachimugawug Menahan. Always wondered about this, because there is a bog on the island, but it's not very big. It's just this thin bog that's adjacent to the old railroad grade. And I always wondered about that. Why did they call that Big Bog Island? And then I realized that this stream, you can see this white line that kind of extends up to the left, which is called Birch Stream, actually goes up into what is called the Elton Bog, one of the largest bogs in the state of Maine. If you've ever gone on I-95 past Old Town, you go right through the middle of it on 95. And that's what this island is pointing out. It's not that island itself. It's actually taking you from a river perspective. Fanny always talked about interpreting place names from an upriver perspective, from a travel perspective. And this is exactly what this does. It's not about the island at all, but the island is something you're going to get to. It's about pointing to that stream that's at the top of that island that'll take you to that great hunting ground, which is that bog. So Big Bog Island doesn't have a big bog on it. It's pointing to the big bog. So over the years, this interpretation has grown and fostered in that way. So I'm going to be talking about this group of islands. The larger island is actually, the old ancient name is Slippery Ledge Island. Today we call it Marsh Island. Sometimes it's been referred to as Stolen Island. And I won't talk too much about that history, but John Marsh who was a friend to the natives of the time, actually found a way to get the island signed over to him when it was actually tribal territory. But I will be talking about the Stillwater River. So it's kind of very interesting that beginning at this little stream that comes in here, coming down this side, and ending here is a completely different river. It's called the Stillwater River, from where Pushaw Stream comes in below Orson Island to where Basin Mills is. It's called the Stillwater River. It's officially called the Stillwater River. And what happened was, in the Treaty of 1818, the treaty stated that the Penobscot Reservation would be all the islands in the Penobscot River from Old Town Island north to Nicketow, which is another island right in Medway, right at the fork. Nicketow means the fork, a fork of two equal weights, the east branch and the west branch of the river to Nicketow. There's an island right there. But there was a lot of argument between the tribe and the state about what Old Town Island was. Was Old Town Island Little Indian Island? Or was it the island that Old Town is on, Marsh Island? So there was a lot of confusion. So all the islands in the Penobscot River. So in the state's infinite wisdom, well, if we take that western channel and call it the Stillwater River, then Marsh Island ceases to become an island in the Penobscot River. Case closed. Slippery Ledge Island is Marsh Island, but yes, slippery, yes, absolutely. And the real kicker is that Stillwater River, that is the ancient name for that part of the river. So they actually took our name for it, and which was something that always confused me. So if you take Fanny's upriver perspective thing and say, okay, that's the Stillwater River, and you realize what is there, and I'm going to zoom into where the Stillwater hits Basin Mills. There's actually a falls. Falls, known for being a good fisheries, is the name of that falls in the language. The one up top, above the red dot. Why would that be called Stillwater? Certainly doesn't look still. It actually looks pretty ruckus. You also have Ayers Falls here, Airwise Fisheries below the outlet. So let's see what's going on between the main stem of the river and the Stillwater River. So as we found out that if you were to try to paddle up the main stem of the river, first of all, you're going around what's called Slippery Ledge Island. And this is called that for a reason. The rocks along the shore of this part of the river are really slippery. And to try to pull up one particular section of this river, which is roughly where the sea is in Penobscot, kind of right in here, is like almost like a horizon line in the river. It's very shallow, and the river kind of goes over a ledge. And to go up something like that, you would pole up it, because you can't paddle up it because the water's too shallow. So you would pole up it, but you couldn't because the rocks were too slippery. And then, as you would go further upriver to where this picture is, you'd get to a bend in the river that was, there's a set of falls there. There was a dam there until just a few years ago at a place called Great Works, what we call Great Works in Old Town. But the ancient name for this was Bad Falls at the site of a bad carry. So another obstacle. And then as you get up to where that island is, next to Stem, there's falls on either side of that are pretty hard to get up. Not to mention the falls between Indian Island and that island, which was the greatest fisheries around, Penobscot. Penobscot's named, that's where you get the name Penobscot from, a description of that set of falls. So, considering that to go up the Stillwater Way, you had one carry, and that carry was known as the Easy Carry. So you could get, by taking a left, you could actually get above all of that quite easily. It might be a slightly longer paddle, but it was the way to go. And the place names reinforce this, that just below the place name where the river forms a channel, why even identify that if you weren't to take that channel around Ayers Island? Ancient name was Aniquis, which Anthill Island. And at the top of that island was an ancient portage which took you across, right past, this is Orono. This is downtown Orono where this is. If anybody's been to Orono, where Pat's Pizza is right along that portage trail. And what's interesting is after they removed the dam below this place a few years ago, me and my wife were walking the shore below where the river forms a channel, and she found a petroglyph on a rock. And I heard recently that someone found a petroglyph at the top of the carry, which is amazing. And by the way, where the river forms a channel, you can hear and see those falls, those Ayers Falls. You can hear them and see them, and the water's very swift, so it's very kind of appetizing to go left and to take this way. Let's move upriver a little bit. Passadumkeag means above the gravel bar. So that stream, Passadumkeag Stream, which is kind of up there by letter A, comes from the east, and it's a watershed that's between two glacial moraines, one called the Whale's Back, one called the Horseback, and you can draw a line, and they line up. But there's nothing in the middle because it's all been eroding through the Passadumkeag Stream, and the stream can move material a lot better than a river can. Smaller cross-section, stronger force. It'll move boulders, it'll move gravel, but as soon as it hits the river, it falls out and forms a gravel bar, which stretches all the way from there, all the way down to, past Porcupine Island. And the river's shallow, no one boats in this. We canoe down it all the time, and we see shifting boulders. Some years a boulder's there, some years it's not. It's all kind of a shifting, and it's undeniable, this gravel bar. And so that stream that's above it, above the gravel bar, is very, very identifiable. And thinking culturally about what a gravel bar means, it means good fishing, good place to put a weir. Stick sticks and stones into the gravel, and you can have fishery. Number 5 up there, it's called an okwidgees, or a fish ladder. That was something I took off a map in 1820 when Joseph Treat did a journey up the river. But as you can see that there's all kinds of place names here, named for resources like bear or porcupine in the language. There's an Eagle Island. That kind of number 8, Walum and Menahan, reaches back in time to the red paint, our red paint ancestors. That means Red Clay Island, and there's a red clay stream, red clay quarry stream. So that goes back to red paint. Number 9 So number 9's a tough one. And over the years, I've struggled with this because it means a white devil island. White Devil Island. And it's always really confused me because I cannot figure out how my ancestors knew who Donald Trump was so long ago. All kidding aside, that is its name. I've used Paula Page. And I've used John Baldacci too when he was in the room. And he told me that that was a good one after. But other Hemlock Stream, Hemlock Island, even Burial Ground Islands. My favorite's Sugar Island, not because we have a cultural tourism program. Some of the Portland school teachers have been to Sugar Island. But the name for Sugar Island has nothing to do, I always thought it was like, oh, there must be a lot of maple trees there. And actually, no, it has to do with the serviceberry bush. And little tiny serviceberries are really sweet, sugar plums. That's what that means, sugar plums. And what's really interesting about that tree, its other name is called shadbush. And it's called shadbush because when it's in its glorious white bloom in early spring is when the shad are running. And for me, that's like this big beacon in the forest telling my ancestors that food is coming, especially after a long winter of no food. So you find these things in the place names all over the place. Blackman Stream, which is in Bradley, Maine today, was called Madamuscontis. Oh, whoa. There's a Madamuscontis up by Lincoln, too. Still called that today. Yeah, they were both known as Madamuscontis. Place names aren't exclusive. They mean plenty of alewives place. So that was more important than saying, oh, you can't name it that. Sure, there's plenty of alewives here, but you can't name it that. So we used to fish by means of spears, weirs, and nets. Bassagassawakeg, which is a Wabanaki word that means we spear sturgeon by torchlight. So it tells you something very specific at that place, what the resource was and how to do it and when to do it at night. David Cook wrote a book called Above the Gravel Bar, which looks at canoe routes in Maine. And he asserted that there was a difference between the hunks and the cooks. I still think there's a joke there somewhere, but I'm not sure what it is. My wife says, no, there's not. But he asserts that a hunk, being a very hard-sounding word, denotes non-canoeability, like Nasawatahunk. Nasawatahunk is a stream. It means a stream that flows between the mountains. And it flows between the Katahdin Range and Double Top. And it's this stream that flows over granite rocks, and it's extremely non-canoeable. People kayak down it in the spring, only at the flood stages, but it's extremely dangerous. So really not something you're going to want to canoe. And the cooks, those are canoeable. Sawadapscook, which is in Hamden, meets very close up, about a half mile, from the Sebasticook. So if you were to paddle up the Sawadapscook, portaged into a place called Pleasant Pond, and then paddled down Sebasticook, you just went from the Penobscot to the Kennebec. Like a major kind of feat, considering if you would have went down to the ocean around Owl's Head, around all those fingers of rocky land that the Maine coast has to offer, and then paddle back up saved yourself days of a journey just by taking that half-mile portage. Granted, it's a 90-mile paddle Haven't done it yet, but I'm going to work on it. The Sawatahunk has a story, a place name story, I call it, which I find very interesting. So there's a story of, we have what's called Mi'kmaq, little people. And I often see these stories of little people, they taught us technology. And in this one story, the Mi'kmaq were sliding down the rocks. If you've ever been to Baxter State Park and you hiked into Niagara Falls, you can actually get in the stream, the Sawatahunk stream, and slide down these smooth granite falls. Pretty fun. So the little people were doing this, and nearby, a couple of Penobscot fellas were fishing for salmon with a sharpened stick. And they would stab the salmon, and they'd try to pull them in, but they were too big, and they would like fall off the stick and just swim away with a puncture wound in their side. So the little people came over, and they taught us how to make a fishing spear that looked like that grabbed the fish after we speared them. Now, I really like this story for a couple reasons. One, it's geolocated. I know exactly where they're talking about. I know exactly where they're talking. And what's really, really cool is that those Penobscot guys were fishing for salmon at a place that we don't see salmon anymore. We haven't seen salmon that far up the river in a long, long time. There's a stream that's above what's called Mattasiunk Dam. Mattasiunk is between Mattawamkeag and Medway. It's a big dam. Tallest dam in the Penobscot River besides Ripogenis Dam. And just above that dam is a stream called Salmon Stream. And in 1983, this guy wrote this article about Salmon Stream, and he says, but the name is a misnomer. There's no salmon here. It's like, well, there's a big blockage in the river. Of course there's no salmon here. And I even went to go far as to call like a fisheries guy and say, okay, hey, I got this stream, and here are the, it's very gravelly beds. And he goes, oh, that's perfect habitat for salmon. And so, the name persists today from an ancient Penobscot name. I call those names that are there in spirit. Like Stillwater River. That's there in spirit. We don't say it in Penobscot anymore, or even an anglicized version of it like, Passadumkeag. But Blue Hill, it's another one. We always called it Blue Hill, just in Penobscot. So sometimes the place names appear in spirit. I'm going to close with a story about Gluskop and the moose. So Gluskop was our teacher. He taught us how to do things. And he wanted to teach us how to hunt a moose. And so he got his hunting party together, and they traipsed through the woods, and they came to this very large lake. And up the lake, he sees a cow moose and her calf walk out to the shore to get a drink. So Gluskop bends down and he picks a stone up off the ground. He affixes it to a stick, he notches it, and he shoots the cow moose dead. As the party approached the moose, which was huge, they realized that she had turned to stone. Now, when I first heard this, I was like, wow. And I had just learned about Medusa, with the snakes and all that. And I was like, wow, it's like that. Like a very fantastic story. And, but I realized that she didn't turn into just any stone. She turned into that stone which Gluskop picked up off the ground and affixed to a stick. This moose becomes what we know of today as Mount Kineo. Mount Kineo is one of the largest repositories in the whole Northeast for stone that is perfect for making arrowheads. It's called kineorhyolite. And that's what this story is telling us. It's not just a fantastic story of this moose turning to stone. It's telling us that that's how you get a moose, by quarrying the belly of the cow moose. Now the calf moose, seeing his mother get turned to stone, got all excited and knocked over a kettle that Gluskop was readying to cook the moose in. And that becomes what we know of today as Kettle Mountain, or it's actually called Little Spencer today, but for many years it was known as Kettle Mountain. Some argue that the town of Cocajo, it's a word that's very close to our word for kettle, Cocajo. And then Gluskop takes off his backpack made of brown ash, and he throws it, and it becomes what we know as Big Spencer Mountain. I've always wondered if that mountain had like a abundance of brown ash, because that's what that was made out of, but I've never been able to find that out. And then he chases this cow moose across the landscape, and this calf moose gets to Penobscot Bay, swims across the bay, and Gluskop jumps with great might. He's got his snowshoes on, he's got his dog in tow, and he jumps over Penobscot Bay, and he lands right at Dice Head, which is right at the southern tip of where Castine is. And he was said to land with such force that his snowshoes made imprints in the rocks. And it was from that point that he got the upper hand on the calf moose and shoots it dead. Pretty fantastic. So I decided I'm going to go to Dice Head and see these snowshoes, and I went there, and what I found was this kind of gray granite with all of this crisscrossing of white quartz going through over the whole rock. Now, I've told you I've taken Maine geology classes, and I understand geologically how this was formed. And people often ask me, well, you got the story and you got the science, which do you believe? I said, it didn't matter. It doesn't matter. Because when I went down over the stairs there, past the lighthouse, down over the stairs, and I was standing among these rocks, I knew I was in the right place. It was undeniable. Now, were they imperfect shapes of snowshoes? No. But these look like the webbing of snowshoes. And that's all that mattered, is that place was that identifiable. And it was from this point that he shoots the moose, and Cape Rosier, which is a hill nearby, becomes what they call the moose's rump. And it was traditional to take the entrails and throw them to your dog. You never, ever fed your dog hand to mouth. Just wasn't something you did. And you would never feed the moose, the sweet meat of the moose, to the dog, because it was believed that they would lose their inability to track that animal. So they got the entrails. And so Gluskop threw the entrails to the dog, and they landed on the shore of an island, on the shore of Islesboro, what is known as Islesboro today. And when I went out there with Bill Haviland, he's an anthropologist who grew up on Deer Isle, he took me out in a lobster boat, and we pulled out of this cove, and he pointed across the bay 12 miles. He says, you see that white dot over there, 12 miles away? Yeah. He says, that's where we're going. I thought it was a house, some mansion that he liked. So we headed over there, and as we got closer to it, it was the moose entrails. It's this large quartz rock on the shore. And we could see it from 12 miles away. And then Gluskop threw the liver, and it lands at this place in the bay. And it's unlike all the other rocks in the bay. It's reddish brown, liver color, and it's unlike all the gray rocks that are there. So it stands out. So when we take all of that together, you can see where the snowshoes are here, the entrails are here. And the entrails about 100 feet away from a portage that takes you across the island. So it was a beacon for travelers to head for that white dot instead of going all the way around this big island, Long Island it was called in the language. This long island, you could take a shortcut across it by following the white dot. This was the rump. This is the liver. The liver is a perfect place to see what's called the Blind Cove. So all a roadmap just by killing this one calf moose. Oh, right, just one last. So kind of an extension to this project was the 13 Moon Project, where we made 13 drums and I painted them and I did a study of the environment. So each of our moons are named something in the language that tells you something about what's going on at that time, whether it's when ice forms on the margins of lakes, or the moon we're in right now is when owls and eagles lay their eggs. So each one tells you something about what's going on around us and throughout the year. So I painted these drums, and I often painted them like at the end of the moon, because I was like, I took the whole moon to kind of figure out what to paint. So this is kind of an extension of understanding the landscape, but in very kind of prescribed times. And I am going to end it there. I guess we can open it up for questions for a little bit. How are we doing on time? Oh, she says we're good. So there's some microphones right here. If you don't want to get up to go to the microphone, maybe someone can bring it to you, but well, you can come up to it. It's right there.
Someone has to be first, right? I understand that the coastal counties all have English names, Cumberland, Lincoln, and the inland counties have native names.
I never even thought about that, but yeah, that may be.
You would tell me why.
I don't know why. Probably because of colonial occupation. That Waldo wanted his name on that county, and it's Washington. I don't know if he had anything to do with naming it in Lincoln, but. Was there a question around that, or you?
Yeah, I was wondering why.
Observation. So yeah, I'd never even thought of that, but yeah. It's interesting how we name place in Maine. There's oftentimes we name them after towns, after old, dead white guys. Sometimes we name places after other places. The famous signs, China and Norway and Sweden. Sometimes they're after biblical places like Canaan. There's all kinds of, like in the mid-coast area, we got Union, Liberty, Freedom, kind of the way life should be names. There's even a Maine. I think it's just like one house in Aroostook County, at the corner of two roads. But there is a Maine. You can find it on the map. Any other questions? You guys are going to let me off easy. Oh, quick.
More cultural question. I'm wondering if you could speak more about the history and influence and effect of Catholicism where you grew up.
Wow, yeah. So Catholicism was very damaging from a cultural standpoint. I mean, so very early on, let's say 1604, we get a black robe. Champlain brought him over in our community, and a couple of things happened. One, they start to undermine your traditional leaders, your medicine men, your traditional spiritual, don't do that. And then following that very quickly, within a generation, you have what's called the Great Dying. So 1616 to 1619, you have 75 to 90% of all Native Americans are dying from European diseases. You know, Europe went through the plagues. They lived in big cities next to their animals. They went through all of that. We lived a little more spread out, a little more conducive to the landscape, and didn't have any immunities to those types of things. And then you have your black robe walking around healthy and use that to their advantage. So you get a lot of deathbed conversions, baptisms, and then people who survive attributing it to Catholicism and Christianity. So, you know, very early on, this really takes hold. You know, we got a church in our community, which is one of the longest continuously operating sites of Catholic worship in this country, in Old Town, on Indian Island. It's not the same building, but it's the same continuously operating sites of worship. And Kateri Tekakwitha, if you know who she is, there's a statue of her in our church. She was I believe she was Mohawk, or one of the Iroquois tribes, who got horribly disfigured, had smallpox, but survived, but then went from community to community to aid the sick because she couldn't catch it again. And so she has been now honored by the church, and is a saint, I believe. Is that enough? Hi.
Hi. Could you help me with this? So I have a presumption about what I imagine has been passed on, passed down, as well as imagining what's been lost. And so my question has to do with whether a word like recovery is appropriate, and whether that's something that's active, or whether that's kind of a misunderstanding of Native people in Maine and the continuance of their culture. Just what is passed down and what's being recovered, and is there such a thing as recovering?
Well, I don't think it's about recovery. It's about what we're holding near and dear to our hearts. It's about what we pass on to our children. And it's about taking the responsibility to learn the language. It's about understanding the culture. It's about sharing our stories. You know, I'm not Roger. I don't say the same stories Roger does, because we're two different people. He was here a few weeks ago. But this is my voice, and this is what I choose to carry on. And for me, it's not about recovering anything. It's about honoring my ancestors and this landscape that they lived in. And it's not about drawing a boundary around this was Penobscot territory, because we can't do that. We don't understand there wasn't that. There was a blending with our neighbors. If we even considered them neighbors, they were just other people, or a part of who we were. And so it's not about a recovery. It's not about that for me. It's about, for me, my gift is about history. It's about knowing those stories. It's about finding tribal voice somewhere in. History's been very disappointing, because there's not a lot of tribal voice in the historic record. This is why I'm more of a geologist, and place names was a way to kind of call out a native voice in the landscape. because it's there, it's still there. And so my gift and my way to perpetuate that knowledge is to share it. And it isn't about recovering that, it is about honoring that. Thanks.
You may have already said this, but is there a reason behind the name Penobscot?
What does Penobscot mean? So Penobscot is a description of the falls that are in Old Town. And it means place of either the widening rocks or the white rocks. And this is always, this whole white rock thing had confused me for a long, long time. Because I always look for the evidence. If I got the name, I look for the evidence. You know, Carol tells this story. We did this place names map a few years ago, and her and the cartographer, Margaret Pierce, who was a native woman from out west, she's Potawatomi, and they went out to this one place where it was talking about the shiny shores, and they spent all day there trying to find this thing, and they went to leave the island that they were on, and they could see in the rearview mirror that the sun was setting, and this beach across the way was just this golden shine, just perfect. We're always looking for the evidence that corroborates the words. And Penobscot always confounded me because was it the white water cascading over the rocks? We didn't know because there's a dam there now. It's like you can't see how my ancestors saw it. And that dam had a hole in it a couple of years ago. Like they said you could drive a VW bus through the bottom of the dam. And so, well, that ain't very efficient, so we better fix it. So they had to draw down the water, like to historic low. No one had ever seen the river that low, ever, in a long time. And I compared it to pictures that I had from Spec from 19 teens. I was comparing 100 years earlier. And the water, a couple summers ago, was lower than back then. And something happened about 4 or 5 days after the water levels were down. This white film appeared on all the rocks. And I was like, aha. So it was like, I was like, there's my white rocks. And it's a natural phenomenon. I don't even know if it's a lichen or there's something on those rocks, but it appears in that place. And it wasn't until those rocks were taken out from underwater and exposed as they had been historically that they revealed this. So Penobscot is a description of those falls, and it means place of the white rocks or where the rocks widen out, and which is a both ample description of that place.
Thank you.